play. All right, we are live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the panel, The State of Conversation Design and Future Trends. My name is Greg Bennett, and I am Conversation Design Principal at Salesforce. And I'm super excited to be moderating this panel with our awesome guests from across the globe. So I'm sure, as you can tell from the differing colors of everyone's backgrounds, that we're all in different time zones. I'm going to go ahead and start introducing our panel. Probably the one with the best time zone at the moment at 3-something p.m. is Hans van Dam, who is co-founder and CEO of Conversation Design Institute. He is also the Dean of Conversation Design Institute, which is the world's leading training and certification institute for conversation designers. I seem to have lost video of Hans and Nikki at the moment, but we're going to keep going. Conversation Design Institute works with brands like Walmart, JP Morgan, Google, ABN AMRO, and many others to make their AI assistants more human-centric, helpful, and natural. Hans lectures at multiple universities and speaks often at conferences around the world. So thank you for joining us, Hans.
Happy to be here.
Our next panelist is Srini Janarthanam, who is conversational AI engineer at NatWest. Srini, you want to give a couple words about you and your background and your work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Greg. So I'm a conversational AI engineer at NatWest. So my journey into conversational AI actually began a long time ago. So in the year 2000, 2001, I think, when I built my very first chatbot. It was a natural language interface to a database system as part of my undergraduate degree. And then I did my master's and my PhD in AI and natural language processing. I worked at Heriot-Watt University and Edinburgh University as a postdoc researcher for a few years. And then I started helping out small and medium businesses design and build chatbots. And then I joined NatWest in the year 2018. So I think it's really been a fascinating journey. It's a very challenging field to be in. I've been really motivated and inspired to sort of build machines that can have conversations with us, and it's really an amazing field to be in. So I'm really happy to be here on this panel. So thanks for having me, Greg.
Thank you for joining us. All right, our next panelist is Brynn Chadwick, lead product designer of conversational experiences at NIB Insurance Australia. Brynn, I take it it's rather early or late where you are, depending on how we're looking at the time. Care to share a little bit about yourself with the audience?
Yeah, good morning from Australia. I've been in conversational design for a few years now. And more leading that product design role, looking at the entire product. So that being for us a conversational call center or contact AI. And that sort of takes on everything from conversational design to data and annotation, and looking at how not just a member experience with conversational AI, but also experience for our business as well. So how they interact with the business and the member. And yeah, that's been a journey definitely in itself, and I'm sure we'll get into it more soon.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, and thanks for joining us so late or early. Hi, Nikki. Nikki Dunagan is content strategist at Oracle. She's currently a content designer at Oracle NetSuite, focusing on conversation design best practices. Nikki has a background in journalism and has worked the past 4 years as designing conversations for digital assistants for both text and voice. Her focus is on using storytelling and human-centered design in order to create successful end-to-end conversation flows for clients. She's worked in various industries, including automotive, hospitality, retail, restaurant, and sports entertainment. She also prides herself on the work she's done researching and educating on conversation design best practices. So thank you for joining us, Nikki.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and take us all into the first question. I know I just sort of gave, either I gave a little bit about your backgrounds or you gave us a little bit about your backgrounds. I'm very interested in learning about how everyone came to work in conversation design. I've seen sort of across the industry, we all take different paths to coming to this role. And I think it'd be great for people to hear what your path was. So let's start with Nikki.
Sure, yeah. Like you mentioned, I started in journalism. I worked for some newspapers and some magazines, radio stations, before transitioning into doing some product writing. And I was ultimately brought in to work on chatbots because I had experience doing some sentiment analysis on in-app content. And so my work doing that kind of transitioned into starting to copyright for these chatbots. I was actually one of the first people to really work on conversation design at my company. So I had to do a lot of learn by doing, a lot of research, a lot of experimentation, a lot of failure, a lot of learning from that failure, and eventually got to the point where I was able to kind of start putting together these like best practices and some of these principles for conversation design so that I can then continue to educate not only just inside of our company, but outside of our company on best practices for conversation design and why it's important to have a conversation designer on your team.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. All right, who wants to go next?
I'll take it because I'm closest to Nikki, I guess, in the journey. Because I'm a field novelist. I always wanted to be a writer. I was very excited about that in university, and nobody was interested in anything I'd written. So then I became a copywriter, and I started working as a tech incubator, which was a lot of fun. I learned more about the technology, and I had my own little startup, which failed miserably. So I ended up working in customer service, and I was actually answering questions on social media. And when that became automated and chatbots became a thing, and I saw everybody struggling with how to write for it, I was like, oh, I know how to write dialogue, and I understand the technology part of it, and now I understand the service space. So that got me interested, and I started exploring all of that, and finding people to learn from, to eventually becoming to what it is today, where we're the ones teaching others again. But yeah, it's really lots of failures and misery on your way as a writer lead to conversation design ultimately.
All right. Thanks for sharing.
I can go from there. I used to run a small agency here in Australia called Mate. A very cliche name, I know. And I found, like, especially being young, it was hard to compete with other bigger agencies. So a point of difference at that time, especially in Australia, was creating conversational chatbots or really basic sort of bots through Messenger, and we sort of created a point of difference through that. And I knew a copywriter who somehow showed me these things, and I thought, this is the next thing, especially here, especially in customer service for us, because it was an easy way to show value. And then we just sort of started applying a lot of copywriting skills to some basic UX design practice, and sort of creating workshops and going to places like General Assembly and Academy XI, and sort of, I guess, pretending like we knew what we were selling, and sort of creating a conversational design workshop, which in turn sort of helped us market ourselves as an agency that specialized in conversational AI when really we were guessing. And we definitely created some fake marketing material, like top chatbot agency in Australia and all sorts of silly things like that, until we got our first client. And really, I guess you could say, winged it from there. But as the community's grown, obviously a lot of that stuff has sort of formalized itself, like with what Hans does and other things. But it was very much guessing at the start. But applying traditional design practices is really good content writing.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing.
I was on mute, so that's the most.
All right.
So you should say that in a video conference. Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, it's on everyone's bingo card. Yeah.
So I already mentioned about my adventure. So I did start my first chatbot in the year 2000. So it was really fascinating. So I have to add a big caveat to this. question that I'm not a conversation designer as such. Like, I work in technology and I build technology solutions for Cora, which is our virtual assistant facing the customer. And on top of this technology solution is where conversation design sits. But I'm very interested in conversation design because it is the only way you can expose that technology to the customer. And so I started building chatbots, and there's different kinds of ways in which the data that we have can be exposed to the customer. And I thought, the best way to do that would be a conversation, right? So why can't we just have a conversation about all the data we have? So the data could be in different formats. So I've worked on a number of different systems, especially when I was doing my PhD and my postdoctoral research in Heriot-Watt and Edinburgh universities. I worked on a number of systems. We built one called Spacebook, which is a project where we were exploring physical spaces. So that's why it's called Spacebook. And so basically, you'd be walking around in a city like Edinburgh, and the chatbot would be able to track where you are and be able to kind of have a conversation about the whole space. Say it'd be like a tour guide, and you can have conversation about, what's that I'm seeing on my left? So, and then it knows where you are, and it tells you a story about that statue and things like that. So there's a lot of things you can explore, from storytelling to just having task-based conversations, you want to book a ticket? No, let me help you do that. So there are different levels of conversation. There's different complexities involved and so on. So I've kind of worked on many different conversations, worked on healthcare chatbots. I've worked on tourism, education, and things like that. So every conversation is different. Everything's got a different sort of goal in it. And then I really find it very, very fascinating, the whole idea of conversation design. But the thing is, I work in technology, so I'm basically providing all sorts of context to conversation designers that they can use to make that conversation come to life.
Got it. Thank you for sharing. I think that also leads us really nicely into my next question, which is, and I'm very interested in this, particularly as a conversation designer myself. How do you describe conversation design for people who don't work in this field?
It's putting the words in the mouths of the robots, right? That's kind of usually what I say is when you ask Google Assistant or Alexa a question, whatever it says back is created by a conversation designer. So yeah, algorithms need parents too, right? So in a way, we're the parents of these robots and teaching them how to speak. But I think, I like to add always that there's just a very big platform shift where it went from, personal computers to apps to now AI assistants. And if you look at design, it went from graphical interface design to UX design to now conversation design. And I like to always put that in that big context because I think there's a big misconception that conversation design is an add-on for a UX designer, but it's a completely different beast in and of itself. And just how big UX design is and how detailed that is as a field, that is what you're going to see for conversation design as well. So sort of, the way you can't imagine a company without engineers today, you will not be able to imagine a company without conversation designers 5 years from now. So it's a much bigger deal, I think, than a lot of people realize, actually.
Yeah, I know. I try to think about it. Oh, go ahead, Brynn.
I was just going to say, you said that really well. I'm going to steal that.
Hey, I'm glad this is recorded. Let's go.
Yeah. No, I think about it in terms of explaining it to people who aren't in the field. I like to think about it in terms of how do I explain my job to my parents? It was very easy when I was a journalist to say, oh, this is what I do. I would hand them a newspaper and say, read my article that I wrote. But it's a little bit more difficult when you're designing and building something that they can't physically see. So I always boil it up to I write what the robots say, which is a very limited piece of what I actually do. But I feel like that's the simplest way to just explain what you do to people who may not be super involved in this industry.
Got it.
Yeah, that's a good one. How you explain it to your parents, because I used to try to do the same, and I'd be like, oh, that thing online. And they go, yeah, I hate that. I just want to speak to someone. But I got them a Google Home for Christmas, and taught them how to interact with that sort of home assistant, and it definitely shifted their focus a little bit more to see that it could be a useful companion, not just someone stopping them from speaking to a customer service rep.
Yeah.
So
now my parents think that I can solve all their problems when Alexa doesn't answer their questions. So like, I don't know that I am the right person for that.
yeah, my dad's realized it. He's like, you just can say anything really stupid and I can get to talk to someone straight away. And I was like, so he doesn't even ask anymore.
So I usually try
Users
to
gaming the system. Oh, go ahead, Srini.
Yeah, I the way I do that is like, I try to tell my kid, like he's 7 years old, and I try to tell him like what I do at work, and I tell him like I teach robots to talk, or talking robots. So he always imagines a physical robot, but it's like no, nothing like that. But the way I would define it is like, since I'm working on the technology side, I always think like it's the creative layer on top of the technology stack, and if you want an analogy, it'd be like if technology is the cake, conversation design is the icing on the cake. It's like, it's really about bringing life into the chatbot, really. So if you have the technology, yes, you can build a basic chatbot, but if you want to make a really good chatbot, you need a good conversation design. And it kind of includes everything from understanding what the user wants to providing it with the conversational skills to take the user through a conversation, giving it a personality and a character profile and everything. So it kind of encompasses everything, and bringing it to life. So in a way, you can also look at like, the goal of a conversation designer is to produce an engaging and delightful conversational experience. So that's how I would define it.
Beautiful.
Did we
lose Greg?
No.
Oh no, we lost Greg, but that's okay, because I think because we have the list of questions here, so we can just continue, right? So, or did we lose Nikki too? No, you're still here. So the next question that we're going to discuss is, what are the key principles of conversation design for your work? So what's that for you, Nikki?
Yeah, so I think what Srini was saying kind of goes really well into this. Personally, I have, and based on the research and experimentation that I have done, I really have 3 principles that I define before I start writing any dialogue. First is establishing a purpose for the assistant. Why are you making this assistant? And the answer shouldn't be because we have the technology and because it's cool. If that is your answer, it's probably not going to be very successful. The second principle is determining the value to the user. What is your user getting out of this interaction that they can't get somewhere else? And how does this interaction really improve their life or solve for some of their pain points they're having with their current kind of experience? And then lastly, and probably most importantly, and I know this group has probably talked about this a lot, is establishing a trust for the user. That trust is the willingness of the user to continue to engage with the system, and to continue coming back with the system. And so, we build that by creating consistency through the brand voice and through the accuracy of the data you're giving. But I really love that analogy about the cake, about the icing being that cake. And I think I'm going to start applying it to these principles as well, because it's like, if you want that icing to be good, you have to have all 3 ingredients. And I think I'm going to start identifying those principles as ingredients to make the icing.
Go on.
Oh yeah, no. So I'm thinking now, should trust and empathy, should that be the icing on the cake, or should that be the core ingredient of the entire cake? Right. So how do you also create empathy and trust and inclusivity in how you train your models and how you talk and how you make people feel understood? Which I guess. This was an interesting thought that popped into my head, but go ahead there, Srini.
Yeah, so I thought I'll add to that list. So I think they're all really very, very relevant, but also because ethical AI is kind of becoming like a hot topic, and it's become really, really important as well. Like, it's not just talking for the sake of talking, but it's really something that we should all be thinking about. And, from that perspective, explainability and transparency is becoming very important as well, and respecting users' privacy So if the shopper is asking for a piece of information which the customer does not want to give, then we should be able to deal with that, like in a reasonable way. So it shouldn't be like take it or leave it or that kind of conversation. And also things about fairness and not being biased or discriminative against any user group. And those are really important things to add as principles for conversation design as well. So especially because this I mean, we are getting a lot of machine learning models to be applied in conversation design these days. So we need to be really careful about these principles being applied as well.
Yeah. For you, Brynn?
Yeah, for us, I guess a big part is like who the bot is, depending on the brand. Because we work as a larger group, and we obviously have sub brands under that. So defining a persona and a brand voice and its style guide and language used, and not explaining things in too much depth, and providing short, sharp answers to things depending on the use case, especially I guess service based. Really defining the goal for that bot in its space, and defining the goal for the user and what they're trying to achieve, and then sort of figuring out what jobs the bot must do then to help solve those problems for the user. And then from there, I guess, designing the conversation itself, and a lot of that stuff coming from previous conversations we've seen in the past with users, and building up a picture from real customer data to be able to support them going forward, no matter what channel they're sort of coming to us on.
Yeah, so how do you keep them involved? Because for us, it's always like, or the way I look at it now, it's like, on one hand, you want to make sure you understand what people say. So that's you're training your model, making sure that everybody is understood and that it is inclusive. But at the same time, you want to make sure that people feel understood, right? So what is it actually that they're trying to solve? And what is the anxiety? What kind of anxieties do they have? What kind of what motivates them to reach out? And also particularly because you're dealing with such limited real estate in a conversational interface, that if you lose someone, they're gone. So empathy becomes even increasingly more important because you just have less real estate. So you really want them to feel understood and have confidence that the AI assistant's going to help them, right?
Yeah, I can agree there. Especially, I think I've seen something a while ago. It's bad UX on a website. You can eventually click around and find what you want, right? But bad UX in a conversation just ends and they leave. So, like you said, there's a lot more importance on empathy and crafting a conversation that feels a little bit more natural, as opposed to letting them figure it out themselves. Because instantly, as humans, if one of you stopped talking to me in the correct manner, I'd be like, are they all right? This is over.
Right.
Whereas on a website, I'll be able to click around and find it eventually.
That's a really great point, and that's something that like you were mentioning, if there's a bad UX on a website, you can, or if a website just doesn't work for you, you can point out exactly, like, the colors are wrong, the font's too big, I can't click on this. But when something goes wrong with like a voice interaction, it's kind of hard to pinpoint, because we see our communication with an assistant, because a lot of times it has a human voice attached to it, the same way we see communications with real humans. And we assign a lot of these subconscious, like, preconceived notions we have to regular human communication to human to assistant communication. And there ends up being like a disconnect there, because it's not a human we're communicating. It's an assistant that has been built and taught. And
but also like how
like
that plays
we have to parent
what
the
Srini
algorithm
says, right? Because if we're putting so much emphasis on empathy and making people feel understood, and we ask a lot of them. They have to give a lot and be emotionally invested to even get success and value from the AI assistant. That comes with a lot of responsibility on our part. And that also, if you then look at security, transparency, privacy, like, how do you make sure that you have an open AI? Because the restaurants we like the most are usually the one with an open kitchen, where we can see how the food is being prepared and how it's being served to us, and that we really understand and get a peek behind the curtain. So if you get people emotionally invested more, you want to have more of their transparency probably as well, to sort of counterbalance that a little bit.
Awesome.
Yeah, and that's where the importance of research comes in. I think, having having an understanding of who your users are and like what types of personas those users have is really going to help you drive that empathy. Like being able to understand where they're coming from with their questions is going to help drive that, all of that. So I think again,
so
research
folks,
is
hear me
extremely
really quickly.
important.
Sorry to interject. Am I
the
back?
Beginning of all
Okay,
this.
great.
Greg, welcome back.
Awesome. And I came back. It sounds like I'm back at like the
You're
best
back.
part of the conversation. Go ahead, Srini.
Yeah, so I was going to say that, so it's all about setting that expectation, right? At the beginning of the conversation, and it's really very difficult as well because with chatbots and conversational AI, it's always about customers or users anthropomorphizing the bot, like so they actually apply the human qualities on a bot, like they don't do that as much on other types of interaction like graphical user interfaces and things like that. But so if something goes wrong, they would be more forgiving, be able to try and figure out some other way. But then if something goes wrong with chatbot, it's more like as I'm expecting human level experience, but I'm not getting it. So we could easily push them into this uncanny valley effect, like so we paint a rosy picture at the beginning of the conversation, but then in the middle of the conversation it kind of becomes really difficult for the user.
And I think the intersection of what you've all been covering is really important in terms of like conveying empathy, being transparent. And I think like what we're fundamentally talking about here is that conversation has historically been a quintessentially human trait, a human interaction. And so it automatically invokes all these perceptions and assumptions about humanity and that social interaction. And now that we are sort of parenting machines and teaching them how to become social, then I think, for me, like, I'm a linguist by training. So drawing from linguistics, I think, is extremely helpful in trying to understand what are the patterns of these interactions. And like, as a design principle, how can we adhere to those patterns? But then I think back to the intersection of what Srini and Hans, you were both saying, is the idea of like diversity in language. Not everyone speaks and has conversation in the same way. And we want to be as inclusive as possible. And that in and of itself can cultivate empathy with the customer. So I think the intersection of all of these, particularly like you were saying also, Nikki, about research and whatnot, how can we leverage existing research as well to inform the way that we approach these designs? I think this is fabulous discussion. In terms of getting this going, like, so as you're applying these principles in your work and moving forward with it, who all is involved in that process? What are the other types of roles that, as a conversation designer or someone working in conversational technologies, you work with in order to get a conversational product to market?
Ooh. You can work with anything, right? Like, it depends how heavily invested the company is. I find in the project, you can sometimes find yourself the fun little project on the side where everyone just thinks you're a bunch of if statements, or you could be quite heavily integrated from a marketing experience or from a voice experience, working with that team, or it could be completely customer support and really customer focused. So you're working a lot more with a contact center support team. But as far as the team that sort of makes up maybe at our enterprise level with day-to-day operations, is definitely a range of developers. Myself as a product designer, conversational designer, who works quite closely with the content team, and now as we move heavily more into, NLP and NLU, we work with anything from DevOps, people who help set up our environment, through data scientists who help manage our models, through to a range of data annotators who will keep that model relevant or in tune with what people are talking to us throughout the year. So, the information in there doesn't go out of date and that the accuracy lowers itself. That's only my experience there. So I'm sure everyone has something different.
I think it depends on the company you're with too, because, I've worked at larger companies where you have all the resources to have a conversation designer and a copywriter and a research team and a data analyst and, et cetera, et cetera. But there's smaller companies out there, especially think about startups. You have one title but you wear 27 hats at a startup. And so you may be a conversation designer by your LinkedIn bio, but you may be all of those things at once. It really just depends on
I think like
the resources
when it comes to conversation design
has.
teams, the big challenge that most companies have, like who is in the team and who is supporting the team. Quite a few projects fail because they put people in the team. Like if you put too many engineers in the actual chatbot team, they're just going to be engineering and they're going to continue to engineer, right? And that sort of takes away from the design. So in our teams, we see three roles, right? So we teach one workflow, a bunch of steps, and then sort of different people take responsibility for different steps. So we see AI trainers, which are really the people that turn data into understanding. So they're training the models, they do intent scoping, they do the implementation, they optimize. So they're not engineers. They sort of sit between the engineers and the designers. And then you've got so they configure the AI system, whatever you're using. And then you've got the conversation designers that really turn knowledge or a business process into a conversational flow. So it's more like the UX part of it. And then you've got conversational copywriters that are really your expert copywriters that think about personality, psychology, really turning words into dialogue. And yeah, if the team's small, then it's one person doing everything, or two people, and one's a bit more technical and the other one's a bit more creative. But as it scales, you sort of see people find their little niche and ownership. And we see for every like 3 AI trainers, you have 2 conversation designers and 1 copywriter who's like the editor-in-chief, which is also like the good balance, because now you got like 50% of the team focusing on understanding what people say, and the other 50% is focusing on making sure people have a good experience and feel understood. So we sort of see those 3 roles that then work together with business leaders, data science engineers, and we try to sort of limit it to that.
So yeah, I think if you ask me that question, I'd say all of the above. And on top of that, if you're in a big enterprise, then you probably might want to get other people involved, like looking at a kind of a systemic view of things. So you probably want to talk to your legal team, your security team, the privacy team, the fraud team, the risk team. So all of these people have something to say about the conversation, because every step of the way you are interacting with the customer, you're saying something or you're asking something from the customer. So these people have a view, and you want to hear them as soon as possible, because you don't want to design the whole experience and then so they're kind of like the gatekeepers, really, and they really have a responsibility for the customer as well as for the business. So I'd say talk to them as early as possible as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that legal in particular is one that folks often won't necessarily think of immediately because they're not usually embedded in a team. But I think when it comes to something like conversation design for a customer service use case, if you as a conversation designer are optimizing for a certain interaction and say, promise a customer a thing, and legal comes in and says, no, you can't promise that. Now you have to change your designs. So I think that's also a great point.
There's also part of that is then also educating legal on it and compliance, right? Because it is a completely different interface than anything they're used to, right? So it's also how do you get their support? Because in the beginning, they just say no to everything, compliance and legal, and rightly so. But then, bring them on to like a little workshop or a design session and get the support and see what it is and how it works. And before it, they'll give you a little more wiggle room on some of these issues once they start understanding the interface. So what we did, we have 2 main steps in our workflow. So first, it's like happy conversation design, where we focus on the happy flow, and then we go into detailed conversation design. We start training models, etc. So at the end of the happy conversation design flow, we just get sign off from all stakeholders, which could then be compliance, legal, business leaders. And once they give the green light, that's when you start doing all the training, implementation, long tail design, and all that, like the heavy lifting.
And also in terms of agreement on the language you use, the legal team would probably want legalese, but you want to keep it light and conversational and casual. So it's good to talk as soon as possible, because It's very difficult to undo things at the very end.
Right.
I hear a few traumas there.
Mhm.
Yeah, I also think the same goes for any kind of content experience team, documentation, the teams that are usually responsible for UI text. They likely also have some kind of process in place for what goes into the product that's text if you're working on a chatbot. So I think, in the same way that you're saying, Srini, about legal and how, they might want you to phrase it a certain way, marketing and, content experience and whatnot might want you to phrase it another. So Hans, I really like your approach of together, conduct a workshop, get that kind of buy-in, and then also, educate in terms of, hey, this is a different experience. So we have different, constraints and different needs for the users. So given all of these roles that we've talked about and how conversation designers, Nikki, you had mentioned there's conversation designers at startups, for example, who wear 27 hats. How do we scale conversation design across organizations? I know this is a really big challenge that folks are facing. What are sort of your best tips for scaling and scoping conversation design at an organization? Hans, I know you work with a handful of different organizations. I'm sure you see a bunch of different solutions here. Do you have anything that stands out to you?
So we have teams that from 2 people to 100 people spread around different countries, and that's why we identify those 3 roles of AI training, conversation design, and copywriter. Right, where if you get the scale, like you need to specialize in certain things, and then having a very clear workflow of all the steps where first we do the requirements where we look at the tech and the audience and the bot personality. Once that's clearly defined, you take your use cases from through the happy conversation design phase in one sprint. Then you get the sign off from the stakeholders. That's your second sprint, and once you get that sign off, you go to the third sprint, and sort of following such a clear workflow where everybody just knows what the step is that you're in and what your responsibility is. That allows it to scale. What we see with most companies, they're on the same journey towards maturity, and it usually starts with one little chatbot or voice assistant that gets a bit smarter, a bit more transactional. Then other departments get excited about it, so they all want to have their little projects before you're juggling like 5 different chatbot projects, and then they start developing one department for conversational AI with designers and that are working with pretty much all the different roles that we mentioned before, and they just take ownership and they have a clear workflow. And once they have a clear, and it's the same with like legal that we touched on earlier, like if you're not really sure of what you're doing, then they will just run over you. Engineers, legal, marketing, doesn't really matter. But once you say, I am a conversation designer, I'm in the part of the conversation design team, and this is how we work, that you get respect, you get confidence, and people have more faith in you as a team, allowing you to take more control of the operation and scaling it. And then once you really get the scale, you sort of have oftentimes like group has their own conversation design team, and then every brand or country or language has their own little satellite team making use of centralized technology. That's kind of how these teams, that's when you go really big.
I wish we had a couple hours because I feel like there's a bunch of stories behind that answer, Hans. I would love to hear what they are. Brynn, I was also wondering maybe what your thoughts are on how to scale this, having worked in multiple organizations that do this.
Yeah, it's a hard one, and definitely there's like quite a clear, consistent process for us, and especially under sub brands, on how to approach it. I mean, and I can sort of agree with Hans there briefly. There's that centralized piece of intelligence there that all different brands can take use of, because there's obviously other sub brands under our insurance brands, and lo and behold, sometimes people ask the same questions or similar questions. And I think sort of keeping that centralized sort of NLU or that model in the same place, but creating a different interface on the top of it, is something we are trying to scale at the moment. But obviously different brands have different personas and different, use of language and different colored chat chat windows. So it's sort of similar, creating a component library to some degree with like another part of the design team that sort of focuses on like our design system, but also working with maybe content teams who have style guides and other pieces of sort of, I don't know what you call it, collateral, and sort of being a part of those bigger processes at an organization. That it's not just a little bit of conversation design on the side, it's sort of getting into the design system, whether it be putting chat window components in, and then sort of getting into the style guide with the content team and sort of unifying it, that it is a big part of what makes up everything, as opposed to just doing your own thing on the side. And then, the design system team being like, where'd you get those components from? Or, why are you using that sort of language? And it's sort of like maybe someone said before, bringing them in on the process, whether it be legal or other parts of the department, and making them have their input or feel like they're a part of the journey, and giving them some sort of ownership over the spot. And I think internally creating a persona and sort of talking at it like it is this thing sort of makes people have, I don't know, a bit more empathy for it internally as well as the customer. And you can also blame it, talk to Nibby about that one. I don't know, I didn't let that piece of copy go out. But yeah, getting a buy-in at some point, I think, in those larger processes definitely helps.
I think that in terms of, as we think about and talk about things like scale, I think inherently the next thing that sort of comes to mind is not just scaling the practice, but also scaling conversation across potential markets and regions. And I also saw that we have a question in the chat about multi-language chatbots. How do folks approach that kind of work? As you're scaling conversation design or managing conversation design copy across markets, regions, and languages, what are sort of the best practices that you suggest for that kind of approach?
There is sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
No, I mean,
this is I'm enjoying this topic.
I mean, just using Google Translate, it doesn't work, and that's very clear, right? So you already have, if you're a telco and you're in 20 countries, in every country, you're gonna have pretty similar use cases and conversations, right? So you can definitely design the core of that, and what we do is we design it in English and really figure out the use case of, making sure we have empathy, that we understand what, the entire context of the conversation is. We design that, and then in English, and then for every sentence, every prompt, we write the rationale. All right, so that makes it usable for other language and other markets, provided you have trained conversation designers there. Like if they're conversation designers, they can now interpret that for their local market. But if you already look at tone of voice and personality of your AI assistant, that's already challenging, right? So group may have certain core values that need to be manifested in the personality, right? So let's say our AI assistant is open and transparent and humble, or whatever, it can be anything. But those words already mean something completely different in Thailand than in the US, than in Australia, than in the Netherlands, right? So each local market has to take sort of those guidelines from group and interpret that and translate that and localize that to their local market to create their own personality. So Google Assistant's personality is different in every country. Here in the Netherlands, for example, we don't like hierarchy, right? So we don't like hierarchy going down or up. So Google Assistant is very equal to people here in the Netherlands, where in the US it's a bit more humble towards the user. Right, so you want to create that local personality and local tone of voice, and then you can take these designs from like the central repository and localize them for your design team, and that's. Yeah, but it's not easy to do. Like on paper, this is how you would do it, and brands try to do it, but it's very complex. If you do 1 million conversations a day in 30 different countries to manage all of that, it's tricky.
Yeah, I find this topic quite interesting at the moment because I'm struggling with it as well, especially when the entry point to the bot is the same for no matter where you are in the world. And is it creating a different instance where the bot speaks Mandarin, where the bot speaks Spanish, or the bot speaks English? And what I'm struggling with at the moment is during the day, there's a lot of people who speak English and an Australian dialect, or not that it's a dialect, accent, and the bot can understand it clearly. But at night, I notice a lot of people calling from India and Southeast Asia and other places, and then the bot just, while these people are still talking to us in English, that we can't understand them based on their accent, even though they're asking quite simple questions. So I have this real disparity at the moment of trying to figure out how is our NLU performing at different times of the day. And I've been on Clubhouse all over this week trying to figure this question out. And from what I understand, in the US, the US dialect for Alexa is quite good at understanding Spanish and American English in one context. Like, it can understand them both quite well, but anything outside of that, maybe the technology isn't quite there. I found the challenge in chat, everyone's speaking English and I have no idea what their accent is, so it doesn't really matter. And I can provide, product information in 3 different scenarios for, from Thailand to India to Japan, and they can select what resonates with them, even if there's a little bit of English in there. But when it comes to voice, it's just out the window.
I think that's a great point.
Completely.
Oh, go ahead, Nikki.
I was just going to say, I think one of the most important things about all of this is it becomes easier to do. Not that any of this is easy to do, but it becomes easier to do if you have a solid foundation. I know basically what is your minimum viable knowledge for your assistant, your bot, your whatever. If you can get that piece translated across multiple language, then you should be good to go. I think a lot of people look at this and they see their entire spectrum of every question or every answer that they could give, and then they start freaking out over the size and amount they have to translate. But if you kind of hyper focus it down into what is the point, again, back to like the purpose of your assistant, your chatbot, what is that minimum viable knowledge that they have to be able to answer? If you can focus on that, I think then it becomes easier to scale from there, and it's a little less overwhelming.
I think this is a very, very challenging thing to do, actually, because it kind of is at odds with the empathy principle in a sense. So you want to try and kind of build a solution that fits all, but then at the same time you want to empathize and personalize. So kind of it's at odds with each other. So if you want to empathize, you want to localize, you want to identify the kind of conversation that will work for that particular geography. So you might probably need to have a different kind of a conversational flow depending on where the conversation is happening. So I think a lot more user research, I believe, is necessary. So the end goal is probably the same. The end goal is probably the same, or even the sub goals maybe probably be the same. But you may have to go a different route to achieve that goal, and then you need to put those pieces together in a bigger conversation. So it's not just about, okay, here is the conversation tree, and I'm going to just replace all of these leaves from English to French or Spanish. I don't think that will work. I think if you really want to be empathic, really figure out what the customers want and or how they talk, and kind of make the adaptations for that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I see folks who are just really quickly, I see folks who are alluding to that in the chat as well, about how you can't just do a one-to-one translation, that even like the cultural aspects are important. I think that's absolutely salient for this type of exercise as well.
Yeah, but I think there's two different scenarios where, because what Brynn said, so if you have one entry point and you just have people from all over the world, talking through that same assistant there, then you have completely different challenges than what I was initially referring to, that use case, is where you have lots of companies that, every local market has just created their own little customer service chatbot. And then, they got excited about it. So group all of a sudden says, oh, we need to bring it all together, right? So you have 100 different deployments of AI assistants versus one AI assistant where everybody's interacting with, right? So there's, those are two completely different operations in a way.
Absolutely. I think that even like, whether it's across markets or, as Brynn was saying, with world Englishes, so the way that they speak English in Australia is different than the way they speak English in the Philippines, in India, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in
England,
the southern states of the United States, England, California. All of these are quite different, and so I think that that's also another regional versions of how the sort of core language that either the chatbot or the voice assistant produces and also takes in and understands. That's also, I think, another challenge that isn't maybe necessarily the easiest to solve. I think that in terms of one of the things that we could get at as to, how can we assess the efficacy of the chatbot or performance across markets or across regional variations of a language, does come back to what Nikki was saying about research. I'm wondering, like, how do you go about testing and researching the experience of the chatbot before it goes live? What are some of the methods that you like to use? Nikki, I think you're on mute, and I'm sure you're saying something brilliant.
You're on mute.
I can see your video.
She says sorry.
I think or maybe he said okay. I don't, but I really want to know what you have to say about
yes,
this.
I can maybe take that question and make a start. So I think evaluating the performance of a conversational AI solution is the most difficult thing to do compared to any other natural language processing system, like machine translation, being question answering, and things like that. So I think so, because it's an experience, really. Like you're doing a lot of toing and froing, and then at the end of it, it's like how did you make the other person feel, right? So, or what kind of value did you provide the other person? And it's very difficult to kind of quantify it and in an automatic way. So you can always do it part by part, like how good is your natural language understanding. So you could probably do like accuracy and precision and recall and those kinds of metrics, and try and figure out, like using a test set, how well does it do. But then again, you have to actually put it in the real world and see the impact of that understanding, and see how that has affected the overall experience of that conversation. So a lot of metrics have been thrown into the mix, especially last year with all the open domain chatbots like Google Mina and Facebook's Blender bot, and so many transformer based models in the mix. Like they came up with things like sensibility, specificity, average, for instance. It's basically like how sensible are these responses and how specific are they. And you can also look at, like compare two different bots, like you look at one conversation to another conversation and say which of these are very engaging or personable, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of questionnaires out there which you can use as after you have a conversation. So this is all with the test users, like so you have your test users have a chat with the bot, and then fill in a questionnaire about the behavior of the bot. Like was the bot behaving in such a way that you can trust it, for instance? Like all those questions can be answered that way, but again, it's very, very difficult to measure, but we have to do it nonetheless. But it's very important that we measure the performance, and then also keep measuring it as after deployment as well. Like keep monitoring it and see if it is actually achieving its ends. Like it again depends on different kinds of conversations. If it's a sales chatbot, it's about how much sales it can actually make, how many people it can convert. If it's a marketing conversation, it's more about how many people has it really educated. So it's very difficult to measure, because conversation is everywhere, and how well do you measure the impact of a conversation, right? So that's my rant.
Awesome. All right.
Yeah, no, that I can totally agree with a lot of that stuff there.
Oh, we still can't hear you.
We still can't hear you.
Are you back, Nikki?
No.
I'll add before, because I guess Nikki, you can hear us, right? But yeah. No, so what we like to do is actually, before we push anything live, is a Wizard of Oz test. And so the design team creates the conversation, and you can actually just bring in 5 to 10 people, and that's usually the first and they can speak freely like they would with a conversational interface, and you just respond what you've written down in your design. And usually the first person that you tested with says something where like, oh yeah, we hadn't thought about that. With about 5 to 10 people, you get it. You really get a good design, and during that test, you will learn. Do they feel understood? Do they like it? Does it make sense? So you can validate a lot before you start doing anything in your system. So this, in our case, this is like part of happy conversation design. And what we do a lot of times is actually bring in some of these stakeholders. So we bring in legal or compliance in for the Wizard of Oz test, because then they get to experience it, because they might want to rewrite something to make it legally more legal. I don't know what they would want to do, but
right.
But then they will actually experience that, it's a bad experience for them. Right? So they'll work with you and help you iterate on the design. And you can do it with voice, where you just speak out, or you can just do it via WhatsApp and just test it real quick, right? And test your design. Or sometimes we've done when you're like, if you're a live chat customer service, instead of saying, hey, I'm Hans, I'm the live chat support agent, I just say, hey, I'm Hans, I'm the chatbot. And I just test out my design with a customer real quick and see if it holds up. So there you can really save a lot of hours in implementation, because you'll always find stuff that you need to change before you go live. And then it's testing the model with k-fold testing and going after your metrics and completion. There's too many metrics out there. Yeah.
Okay, Nikki, we got you back.
Oh, good. Yeah, so I briefly heard, I had to come in and out, but I briefly heard a Wizard of Oz mentioned, which love that. But yeah, I think for research, I think it's really important to start at the very beginning, like I was mentioning before. You have to do research in order to understand what your purpose is. In order to understand, like I was saying, that minimum viable knowledge, do some experimentation. I know I've worked in chatbots before where we knew we wanted to build a chatbot. We had a reason for it. We had buy-in from both users and leadership, but we really needed to do some more research into like, how do we scale this down? So we did a lot of experimentation into asking people, what kind of things could a chatbot help you with? And we did it kind of like on our property, could it help you more? Are you looking more for like a travel experience? Are you looking more for like learning what to pack according to travel and weather comparison? Are you looking more for like road trips and things like that? Once we were able to narrow down and people were saying, I need to know what to pack when I'm comparing my weather. Then you can build out to kind of collect some more questions as far as, how do people ask, what do I pack for certain weather? That's when we did things like Wizard of Oz experiments. There's also research involved in establishing the personality of your assistant as well. I have worked with clients before who they come to us and they say, we really want like a quirky assistant. And I respond by saying, you're a pharmaceutical company. Are you sure quirky is really the right personality you want? And so we end up going through kind of some research or really internal discovery on what is their, like, how do their employees view them internally? How do people view them externally? And quirky was nowhere on the radar. And what we ended up finding out was that, like, what they meant by quirky was really just approachable and conversational, not too formal, not too jargony. And, that it just goes to show that personality can be subjective. But if we hadn't have done that research, we would have put something out that was way off brand.
Got it. And who did you do the research with? One of Ian from the chat is asking, like, who were the users?
Well, we did when we were launching the kind of the quirky one. That was a lot of the internal stakeholders.
all of the actual research team, the designers. We worked with the marketing team in order to make sure that we were aligned with really the brand voice. When we were doing some of more of the like external research, when we set up that Wizard of Oz experiment, we really kind of launched it to a subset of people. It was like people who may have been following under like a specific number of like categories basically, or variables, so that we didn't basically launch a Wizard of Oz experiment live to every single one of our potential customers, because a Wizard of Oz, you're manually responding on the other end. And that's a little hard to manage, responding to like 100,000 people versus like 5.
Got it. All right. Brynn, really quick, and then we're at the end of time, so I'm going to wrap us up. Drop some knowledge on us.
I was just gonna say the Wizard of Oz definitely great for kicking off and all that, but I think sort of now that continuous training and that mature state of a bot and how to keep it up to date, because I can't necessarily go do a user test or something so specific, because I can go ask. And the answer I'm going to get is like more platform based. Do people like interacting with chatbots, or do they like interacting with us through certain channels? But keeping it intelligent and smart throughout the day or week, I find is, trying to integrate this training process at a lot higher pace, and looking at the frontline staff who talk to our members all the time, and if you're not on the phones, can you be help training the bot? Can you be identifying new conversations at scale? And if you find 50 utterances or 100 utterances, we'll build you a new intent to answer that question. And how do we sort of scale that growth and that mature state? Because a couple of data annotators still, for a sheer volume, can't keep up at the pace that the bot does conversation. So I do wonder how that sort of training and testing process will scale as bots grow and
I love that. I think that really highlights the principle that research should exist throughout the entire implementation process, from the generative stage, like you were mentioning, Nikki, to the testing and evaluation stage, like you were mentioning, Srini, and then also the maintenance stage that you covered, Brynn. So I know we're a couple minutes over. I wish we could keep going for another hour, but I'm also afraid that I'm going to get, my hand slapped by the powers that be. So thank you all. Thank you all for sticking with us throughout the technological glitches. Thank you all for sharing your incredible insights. I know I got a lot out of this conversation. I hope you all did too. And stay tuned for the rest of the conference.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.